Truth Espresso episode 374.
In a world gone bonkers.
It is not, generally speaking, unruly, but fires have been started and...
Where the culture is a dumpster fire.
We're coming for your children.
And churches have lost their way.
I am really uncomfortable with the story of the crucifixion.
It's time to wake up with Truth Espresso.
Truth Espresso.
Your weekly shot of truth. And now your host, Daniel Minnick.
Well, hello there, friends, family, foes, and of course, lurkers alike. This is Daniel Minnick, your host for yet another exciting episode of Truth Espresso. And I have to apologize. At the end of the last episode, I kind of hinted that this next episode would be a continuation of the Book of Mormon walkthrough. But I must confess that some of the events that happened this week, especially concerning the World Economic Forum, kind of piqued my interest. And so I will have to put off continuing the Book of Mormon walkthrough to a later episode, and maybe some of you who enjoy these other topics are cheering, while those of you who, for some odd reason, tune into Truth Espresso only for Mormonism have to be disappointed for another week. But whatever reason that you happen to be listening to this episode of Truth Espresso, I hope that you will enjoy this analysis of the World Economic Forum from my perspective and what I hope to be a biblical perspective. And I've done this before 2 years ago with the World Economic Forum of 2024. So this is going to be a second episode entitled The Hypocrisies of Davos. And so I will cover some things that I've talked about 2 years ago. But of course, this year's one is going to be a little different because the focus of the Economic Forum is a little different this year from what it has been in the past. And I think kind of for the better. Now, if you don't know what the World Economic Forum is, it's basically a bastion of out-of-touch elitism. A lot of influencers, particularly politicians, business leaders, corporate CEOs, basically people of renown, will gather together at a mountaintop citadel in Davos, Switzerland, so that they can feel good about themselves, that they're the world's humanitarians, and they will talk about their ideas of how to make the world a better place, kind of from a secular materialistic perspective, a globalist ideological perspective, and while they're doing that, live it up. Now, from the World Economic Forum's website itself, on their overview for this year's forum, it says, quote, "In this pivotal context, the 56th annual meeting of the World Economic Forum will build on its long-standing tradition of convening stakeholders from across geographies, industries, and generations. It will bring together leaders from government, business, civil society, and the scientific and cultural domains to enable real dialogue, problem solve around shared challenges, and highlight innovations driving the future," unquote. So in other words, it's a big banquet table of planning and control, and you ain't invited. And I'll provide a link to that from the World Economic Forum. If you can stomach going to their website and clicking on their link. Now, the word stakeholder is a buzzword from the World Economic Forum because one of their philosophies is that what's called shareholder capitalism is something that's antiquated from the Industrial Revolution, and it's just greedy business people and people just focused on profit making. But Stakeholder capitalism means that shareholders are only one group of stakeholders, and other ones are environmental interests, cultural interests, and so on. So the World Economic Forum is really the ones who can define what qualifies as a stakeholder, and then those stakeholders then get to determine where industry and policy goes from there. So these people really do want to control the world, at least indirectly. And, when we listen to some speeches, some presentations from the World Economic Forum, sometimes they do send a chill up your spine. And one of them is from a session entitled An Honest Conversation on AI and Humanity. So how will AI change civilization? Well, let's see what Yuval Noah Harari has to say about that.
As far as putting words in order is concerned, AI already thinks better than many of us. Therefore, anything made of words will be taken over by AI. If laws are made of words, then AI will take over the legal system. If books are just combinations of words, then AI will take over books. If religion is built from words, then AI will take over religion. This is particularly true of religions based on books, like Islam, Christianity, or Judaism. Judaism calls itself the religion of the book, and it grants ultimate authority not to humans, but to words in books.
So, after you just had a little bit of cringe there, possibly, listening to that, someone talking about how AI is going to control everything that has to do with words and language, and that even religion itself, especially ones that use a book as its primary source of doctrine and rules, such as Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, that AI, because it processes things more precisely than the human brain does, that AI will eventually take over religion. Yeah, that doesn't sound like a very positive future there. So I'll provide a link to this presentation in the show notes from where I got that clip. Now, who is Yuval Noah Harari? Well, he's a gay secular Jew who's an historian and a writer and a researcher in popular science. And he likes to focus on imagining the evolution of humans as Homo sapiens to whatever technology and the social mechanism of the fourth industrial revolution will produce. In other words, a Bond villain. And fourth industrial revolution is another one of those buzzwords from the World Economic Forum that kind of sums up their idea of what economy and policy would look like in the future, or where they want things to head, while trying to sound like they're capitalist. They are not capitalist in a classic definition of the term. They do not believe in free markets. They believe in something kind of run by elites, like it's some big machine, and they're the ones in charge, and they have policies that feel good, but they're the ones who push the buttons and pull the levers, and they'll claim that it's capitalism, but it's stakeholder capitalism, and you are not a stakeholder. Now, interestingly, a lot of the World Economic Forum, because Trump was going to be there and give a speech, was centered around the effects of Trump on other countries and how they all relate to or stand up to Trump. And one of the most vaunted speeches or praised speeches at the World Economic Forum was one that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney gave. So I'll provide a link to that in the show notes. Something to note about Mark Carney: he used to be governor of the Bank of England and was a higher up at Brookfield Asset Management. until 2025, when he left that because he was appointed interim prime minister of Canada after Justin Trudeau resigned. And then when the elections were held, he won that election against Pierre Poilievre, much to the detriment of the Conservatives in Canada who were hoping for someone better than Trudeau. Well, they got another World Economic Forum elite to run their country. So pray for the poor souls in Canada who have to put up with this. Now, Mark Carney, after throwing shade at the United States for its old world order, Carney said that he was focusing on other alliances so as to be more stable and stand against the bullying of a certain world power. Now, he'd kind of mentioned the United States indirectly, but everyone knew what he was talking about. And so let's listen to a short clip from Mark Carney about what some of Canada's strategy is recently and going forward.
The past few days, we've concluded new strategic partnerships with China and Qatar.
Now, he did talk about partnerships with other powers, but of course, there are also ones that are not normally favorable to the United States. So he's very much indirectly criticizing the United States as being bullies from an old world order. And basically, Canada, for its own sovereignty, must stop relying on allies like the United States and make strategic partnerships with ones that are kind of hostile to the United States. Now, by the way, on January 15th, mere days before the World Economic Forum started the next week, here is what Mark Carney said about Canada's new strategic relationship with China that he's talking about here.
As you mentioned, mine is the first visit of a Canadian Prime Minister to China in nearly a decade. The world has changed much since that last visit, and I believe the progress that we have made in the partnership sets us up well for the new world order.
Did you hear that? Usually people who use the term New World Order are considered conspiracy theorists. That term has been applied to like various ideas of how to get away from World War II era power balances and policies there to try to shift more towards some form of globalism. And usually if anyone brings up the term New World Order, they get quickly shot down as a radical conspiracy theorist. But it's kind of interesting that the Prime Minister of Canada purposefully and intentionally, after lauding his new relationship with China there, boldly and eloquently uses the term New World Order with pauses for emphasis. Now, one must ask, why does Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, have such an interest in China that far around the world when the United States, the world's superpower, is just south of the border, and a lot of Canadians will visit, even get a lot of health care in the United States that they can't get from Canada because they've got to get on waiting lists, and it's more available in the United States. Despite the United States' very flawed healthcare system, it's still better than Canada's. Well, is it just because Trump has threatened tariffs in his second term to get Canada to reduce their tariffs? Well, I'm sure that's one excuse, but Carney clearly has an ideology that's incompatible with the West because he's very much a World Economic Forum guy and less a Western guy. And he's not a fan of the traditional Western policy of peace through strength. Like, if we become powerful enough, we can put other world powers at bay through a show of strength, not necessarily, invading and stuff, but at least flex muscles to prevent other world powers from invading and taking over territories. And that's how we establish peace, through the implicit understanding of mutually assured destruction if all-out war were to happen. Now, Mark Carney's not a fan of that old world order, obviously, because he calls it the old world order and he enthusiastically supports a new world order. But personally speaking, what does Carney himself have to benefit with an alliance with China? Well, he does have an investment portfolio that includes around $7 million in shares of Brookfield Asset Management. Now, Brookfield is a renewable energy company that invests heavily in China, and it used to be headquartered in Toronto but moved to New York in recent years. Now, although Carney's portfolio now, because he holds public office, is in a blind trust, he knows that there are a lot of shares in Brookfield Asset Management, and there's reason to suspect that he would have a personal financial interest in making Canada more dependent on renewable energy resources that would ultimately come from China or require China to produce. Now, I note Canada could be fabulously wealthy if they made use of the plentiful natural resources that exist in their borders. But the globalists don't like that kind of thing. China has an interest in making sure that WEF leaders spew their propaganda about net zero carbon emissions and New World Order and strategic partnerships with China, while bad-mouthing old world order bullies like the United States. Now, corrupt leaders of what Carney called middle nations stand to gain personally from bribes from China if they let their countries stagnate or decline. China likes globalism because countries that embrace that kind of mind virus let their cultures become decadent with moral degeneracy. And then they get into debt to pay for self-destructive energy policies like net zero carbon emissions, of course, mostly through wind and solar farms. And they will happily buy batteries from China to make that happen. And of course, China gains wealth that way. The globalists think that they're morally superior, playing fair and saving the planet. And they think they're strong because a bunch of other countries are on board. But all they're doing is ensuring their own weakness and letting the tentacles of the Chinese Communist Party control their institutions. And I believe that some of these leaders don't really care if their nations crumble and burn as long as they're one of the elites sitting at the table ruling over the ashes. Now, economically and militarily speaking, the primary check on China is the United States, which has declined more slowly over the years than other countries, but the United States continues to carry NATO on its back. And that's why U.S. strength is the enemy of all globalism. And that's why this old world order has to fall, so that the naive new world order can happen. While weak and indulgent middle nations think they can bring the world to a fair and happy place of balanced international cooperation, it only, in fact, benefits the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and the corrupted politicians that they bribe in other countries. Now, think of the allure of globalist ideals, like how the ring of power tricks people to think that they can wield it for good, but it answers only to Mordor, and it must be destroyed in the fires of Mount Doom. Think of it as the temptation for Jedi warriors to succumb to the dark side and to think that Emperor Palpatine's ways are for the health and security of the Republic. And the Jedis, the Knights of the Old Republic, have to stand up against all the odds as rebels to explain that the old way, despite its flaws, is better, and the promises of the new way ultimately lead to totalitarianism. Now, the topic of Greenland seemed to be on the mind of several speakers, including Mark Carney, and here's what he said to applause.
On Arctic sovereignty, we stand firmly with Greenland and Denmark and fully support their unique right to determine Greenland's future.
Now, in early 2025, after Trump became president again, Greenlanders were positive and hopeful that the United States would help them become independent from Denmark, and U.S. officials in Trump's new cabinet visited Greenland, including Vice President J.D. Vance. However, although most Greenlanders want national independence from Denmark, they also don't want to become a territory or province or even a state of the United States. Now, when it comes to Trump, I kind of hold out hope that he could ultimately respect this and work out a trade deal that treats Greenlanders sovereignly, but have an arrangement that economically benefits both for security and for well-being. Now, here's a reminder from the past. Denmark recently apologized for sterilizing the indigenous population of Greenland from 1960 to 1991 by giving teenage girls IUDs. So these are a kind of contraceptive device that they put into girls. It's an anti-pregnancy device. Now, this not only made many of the women there barren, but they experienced the side effects of pain and bleeding. So this was a tragedy, and I think it came from the old eugenicist movement from the early 20th century. Now, I won't hold that against Denmark in 2026, but is there really a good reason for Denmark to hold on to Greenland? Denmark let its NATO defense spending crater after World War II and until recently buckling to the pressure to hit the goal of 2% of GDP. Now, Denmark is striving to hit 3% in 2026, so good job there, Denmark. Now, still, Denmark doesn't do a whole lot with Greenland economically or militarily. Sure, it's nice that they effectively allow Greenland to live sovereignly, but Greenland currently sits as a geographically strategic and economically advantageous prize for, say, Russia or China, if either of them were bold enough to try. It's a mineral-rich and sparsely populated large landmass, and Denmark, like most of Europe, have drunk the Kool-Aid of globalism and renewable energy through wind and solar, and they forget just how much powering their wind and solar goals depend on environmentally destructive batteries from China. So, although recently Denmark has kind of let Greenlanders live free, they're still kind of reeling from the sterilization. They don't have a population that's really growing much, and so you have about 57,000 people living on a huge landmass. A lot of ice for sure, but they also don't have a whole lot of security. So, of course, world powers are going to look at Greenland as something that they could use strategically. There's no avoiding that.
This enormous unsecured island is actually part of North America, on the northern frontier of the Western Hemisphere. That's our territory. It is therefore a core national security interest of the United States of America. And in fact, it's been our policy for hundreds of years to prevent outside threats from entering our hemisphere, and we've done it very successfully. We've never been stronger than we are now. That's why American presidents have sought to purchase Greenland. It's the United States alone that can protect this giant mass of land, this giant piece of ice, develop it and improve it and make it so that it's good for Europe and safe for Europe and good for us. And that's the reason I'm seeking immediate negotiations to once again discuss the acquisition of Greenland by the United States, just as we have acquired many other territories throughout our history, as many of the European nations have. They've acquired. There's nothing wrong with it.
Now, let me go back to Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada's speech and see what he says about Canada's energy and education.
So, Canada. Canada has what the world wants. We are an energy superpower. We hold vast reserves of critical minerals. We have the most educated population in the world.
So Canada is an energy superpower? Well, he said that they hold vast reserves of minerals, but it seems like they don't really do much with it because of globalist policies. So they could talk all they want about what they have, but if they don't use it, other countries might be interested in taking it from them. And if Canada, in its present state, is so energy enriched, Canada should easily contribute, say, 3% of GDP to their share of NATO defense. But no, as Trump said, they badmouth the United States and take advantage of its defense contributions.
Canada gets a lot of freebies from us, by the way. They should be grateful also, but they're not. I watched your Prime Minister yesterday. He wasn't so grateful. But they should be grateful to us. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements.
Canada would rather sit on its natural resources and make partnerships with China to buy batteries for windmills and solar panels. If you don't like leverage from the United States, then Canada, I love Canada, make yourself stronger with the resources you have. No more ESG propaganda about environmental stuff.
My name is Andy Olson, and I want to tell you about Echo Zoe Radio. Echo Zoe Radio is a podcast outreach of Echo Zoe Ministries. Every month, I find a knowledgeable guest to talk about an important and interesting topic that affects the church today. We carefully balance the discussions of positive, God-glorifying doctrines of Orthodox Christianity from a mostly Reformed point of view, with exposés of heresy, false teaching, and poor practice that goes on throughout the church today. You can find us at echozoe.com. That's ECHOZOE.com.
What made this year's World Economic Forum look more like a circus compared to how they've been, say, before 2024, where everyone was just a mouthpiece for globalism, is how Trump showed his de facto control over everyone. Despite all their tough talking, he was still daddy, as NATO leaders called him last year at the NATO summit. His wild speech criticizing other leaders and warning about the meltdown of Europe certainly didn't sit well with most of them there. But it was kind of the straight talking that they needed to hear.
Certain places in Europe are not even recognizable, frankly, anymore. They're not recognizable. And we can argue about it, but there's no argument. Friends come back from different places. I don't want to insult anybody. And say, I don't recognize it. And that's not in a positive way. That's in a very negative way. And I love Europe, and I want to see Europe go good. But it's not heading in the right direction.
He also came asking for Greenland, and he threatened tariffs against countries bad-mouthing his ambitions there. But interestingly, later the same evening that Trump gave his speech, he announced that he was canceling the tariffs, and he got a deal with Denmark and other NATO countries about Greenland. And we don't know everything yet about this deal. It's still kind of in the works. But the U.S. would not take over Greenland, but would get control over certain small portions of it. And other NATO countries would increase their Arctic defense budgets. And this seemed to satisfy Trump. Now, while others think that they talked Trump down to something rather insignificant, Trump gloated on Truth Social that he got something for free. So just think about it. Trump went to the World Economic Forum and heard other leaders blast the old world order over how world powers use economic leverage to get what they want, and that they would not stand for that. And then Trump comes and tells them to their face that he wants Greenland and threatens tariffs. Mark Carney even mentioned tariffs and blasted them, and yet the countries made a deal with him. You know, the art of the deal and all that. Trump showed them that he really runs the show. No matter how much they whine and pretend otherwise, their bark is worse than their bite. And not only that, but Trump arranged to make a session about the Board of Peace, which is part of Phase 2 of the Israel-Gaza peace agreement. So here is Trump at the end after the member leaders signed it.
We continue to, as far as the United States is concerned, we're behind it. And the United States has never been stronger, never been bigger, better. It's doing really well. You see that, building thousands of businesses, plants, factories all over the United States are right now under construction. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. And this is just an honor to be involved with this and to be involved with the great people in this room and the great leaders that are sitting on stage. We thank you very much. And we have many others that have signed up, and they all want to be members of the Board of Peace because it really will be important. This is not going to be a waste of time. We waste so much time on things that never happen. This will happen, and it's already happening. Thank you very much, everybody. It's a great honor to be with you. Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Trump, of course, had most of the coverage and attention at this year's forum, whether positively or negatively. Despite the hand-wringing from most other leaders, he showed that he can get things done and not just talk about lofty textbook goals. Instead of the false sense of peace through globalist fantasies, melting down Western moral values and capitulating to China's dominance, Trump showed that deal-making and some pressure among friends is how to increase defense strategy and make use of resources and build possible multilateral peace in the Middle East. Now, if you've seen those memes where Fred from the Scooby-Doo cartoons lifts the mask from the villain, well, here is U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick on a panel at the WEF lifting the mask behind globalism to reveal how strengthening China is the villain's face behind the mask.
And the Trump administration and myself, we are here to make a very clear point. Globalization has failed the West and the United States of America. It's a failed policy. It is what the WEF has stood for, which is export, offshore, far shore, find the cheapest labor in the world, and the world is a better place for it. The fact is, it has left America behind. It has left the American workers behind. And what we are here to say is that America First is a different model, one that we encourage other countries to consider, which is that our workers come first. We can have policies that impact our workers. Sovereignty is your borders. You're entitled to have borders. You shouldn't offshore your medicine. You shouldn't offshore your semiconductors. You shouldn't offshore your entire industrial base and have it be hollowed out beneath you. You should not be dependent for that which is fundamental to your sovereignty on any other nation. And if you're going to be dependent on someone, it darn well better be your best allies. Okay? And so that is a different way of thinking. It is completely different than the WEF. I viewed the WEF as not a flagpole in the middle, but in fact, they are the flag. Whichever way the wind blew, so it blew. You should have solar, you should have wind. Why are you going to do solar and wind? Why would Europe agree to be net zero in 2030 when they don't make a battery? They don't make a battery. So if they go 2030, they are deciding to be subservient to China, who makes the batteries.
So, for the most part, well put there, Secretary Lutnick. A nation should put their own workers first, secure their borders, and stop outsourcing fundamental things like energy production to China. Now, I recognize the free market economic principles of supply and demand and marginal utility and trade and comparative advantage and distribution of labor. So no country should be able to produce absolutely everything that country needs. Some things are more plentiful in other countries, and there's comparative advantage where I create hats, you create apples, I trade hats because I could produce them better, you grow apples better, so we trade those and we're both better off. That is a true principle of economics, as long as both sides recognize and understand and promote comparative advantage with proper moral thinking. But when a false ideology convinces some countries to destroy the liberties of their citizens and weaken their comparative advantages and cede power to another country that has a bad ideology and really wants to control the world, we need to deal with these bad ideologies so that the principles of free market economics will flourish. So yes, Lutnick is right. How many of these speakers, when talking about going to net zero carbon emissions by 2030, only 4 years from now, and trying to get rid of fossil fuels, if they're so eager to do that, why aren't they manufacturing the batteries? Why are they ceding control over all of their energy production to China, which makes the batteries? Now, let me move on to Javier Milei, president of Argentina, who always has truth bombs to share at the WEF, where he is probably the most unlike anyone else there. He's like a walking, talking Friedrich Hayek or Thomas Sowell textbook, but in Spanish. He knows very little English, so he needs an English translator for his speeches there, even though a lot of what he says is so scholarly. I'm sure it goes over the heads of most of the participants there. He knows his stuff, but he does have both a warning and an encouragement, and here's a clip from his speech.
For some time now, and for some strange reason, the West began to turn its back on the ideas of liberty. That is why in this same place in 2024, I stated that the West was in danger as a result of having embraced increasing doses of socialism in its most hypocritical form, which is wokeism. In turn, in 2025, I explained the mental parasites sown by the left in humanity. However, 2026 is the year in which I bring you good news. The world has begun to awaken. The best proof of this is what is happening in the Americas with the rebirth of the ideas of liberty. Therefore, the Americas will be the beacon of light that will once again illuminate the entire West, thereby repaying the civilizational debt with expressions of gratitude towards the foundations in Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Judeo-Christian values.
So I would definitely give a hat tip to what Milei said there. I'm not going to be a fanboy of any politician. Milei and Trump are both flawed people, but comparatively speaking, they have more truth. And I would even say that Milei understands economics even a lot better than Trump does. But given how they both feel about each other, they both like and respect each other, they're both roughly on the same team, they're better together there. And it's nice to see someone at the World Economic Forum point out wokeism and recognize that it's the old destructive socialism in a new packaging. Now, finally, let me get into some of the hypocrisies of Davos that aren't usually in what is said on stage, but hypocrisies about the forum itself as an event. The very nature of the World Economic Forum is hypocritical about its climate agenda, and I'm going to explain why. Now, this year did seem to be less focused on climate topics and more on AI and world power imbalances and Trump and Greenland and tariffs and such, which probably is a positive move. But nevertheless, the hypocrisy of Davos about climate is indeed galling. And to point out that, I will go to an article from Greenpeace International. Yes, I don't endorse Greenpeace at all. I'm not some environmental activists, but I think it's fitting to show how when Greenpeace talks about her hypocrisy in climate agenda, you might be a hypocrite about it. So here's the article from Greenpeace International about how much private jet usage there is. It's entitled, "One Private Jet Flight for Every 4 Davos Participants," Greenpeace report finds. From January 15th, and I'll include a link to this in the show notes. So Greenpeace points out that in 2024, there were 628 private jet flights for attendees, and in 2025, there were 709 private jet flights, which is a 10% increase. And now I looked up separately and found that in 2026, there were, get ready for this, anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 private jet flights. Now that's more than a 10% increase from last year. Apparently, the climate activist globalist elites who aren't concerned about their own hypocrisy are even less concerned this year. Now, the World Economic Forum imposes the greatest carbon footprint every year while claiming to want to solve it for the world. So rules for thee, not for me. And for more about hypocrisy, I'll go to another far-left website called fightinequality.org and look at an article called 3 Reasons to Protest the Davos World Economic Forum in January. So this is by a Jenny Ricks. I'll put a link to this in the show notes. And from the article, it says, quote, "It's more realistic to say that Davos is a parade of rich people feigning concern for the poor while protecting their own interests," unquote. And you know what? I agree. I don't see anything in this statement with which I would disagree. However, I would disagree with the poster that socialism is not the solution. Another quote from the article, "What billionaire elites are unable and unwilling to understand, even in this time of climate and inequality crisis, is that they do not want to change the broken system of which they are the main beneficiaries," unquote. Once again, I agree. It just would be nice if these people understood the real solutions to these problems. You know, I purposely found these far-left websites to demonstrate the hypocrisy of Davos. And as we notice that there's less climate topics discussed at the WEF this year, is the climate agenda collapsing under the weight of its own hypocrisy? I mean, we need to think recently of Greta Thunberg, the Swedish poster child for Gen Z climate alarmism, who had before went to the UN and gave the infamous "How dare you" speech that everyone has stolen her dreams and that basically the world is in peril of being cooked to death because of the hypocrisy of climate activists not really making solutions. But the girl now in her 20s has switched gears since October 7th, 2023. When you had that demonic attack from Hamas on Israeli civilians during a music festival. Now, apparently, the imminent destruction of the whole world can wait. Justice for Palestinians commands far more time and energy than, the Earth's fragile ecosystem and how the whole world might be destroyed. So there's that. A second hypocrisy of Davos is the shadow enterprise of escort services that explodes during this week of the forum. In my episode 2 years ago that I did about the World Economic Forum, I pointed out the hypocrisy of the carbon footprint of Davos itself, and I also talked about the escort services. So I'll provide a link in the show notes to an article on WION by Abhinav Yadav called Prostitution and Hush Money, What Happens Behind the Closed Doors of Davos World Economic Forum. This was January 16th. This article is in their photo section, so it's kind of captions on photos. Now it says, quote, reports reveal a surge in high-end escorts charging premium rates. The WEF denies these claims, citing a zero-tolerance policy, unquote. Yeah, the forum can deny all they want, but just because they don't advertise these services in their official forum publications doesn't mean it's not a de facto perk. So, just in case I didn't make clear, the so-called escort services are normally women who will charge services from some of the attendees there, very expensive services where they could pay by the hour or pay for a night or pay for a weekend, something like that, for certain sensual services. I don't want to be too graphic here, but this type of thing is legal in Switzerland. Now, from the article again, quote, reports indicate that fees can range from 700 to 2,000 euros per night, with services often arranged discreetly through online platforms or concierges to bypass official security channels, unquote. So while the WEF says that they don't tolerate it, I think they do behind the scenes. The article also notes, as reports do every year, that these escorts dress in formal attire to blend in with the event. But I'm sure private conversations between these escort workers that are usually in the bars and at parties held outside the scheduled sessions make sure that the wealthy elites get their perks, and the escorts in turn get some wealth. So the hypocrisies of Davos every year become more and more obvious and prominent. But I think this year's WEF was rather entertaining, with Trump and Milei kind of stirring up the usual curriculum here and showing that they, rather than the globalist elites, are gaining a foothold over world affairs. Now, I hope that you enjoyed this episode of Truthspresso, and I hope that you will stay tuned for the next episode of Truthspresso, and God bless.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Truthspresso. Be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast app. Truthspresso is a member of the Christian podcast community. Check out other great faith-building shows at ChristianPodcastCommunity.org.